I had dreamed of this day since I was a little girl, rehearsing the walk down the aisle in front of my bedroom mirror, pretending the chipped wooden floor was marble. But nothing prepared me for the moment. The ballroom doors opened, and the world I thought I knew shattered before my eyes. The chandeliers rained light, like molten gold, every crystal prism catching fire. The quartet played Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, and the scent of roses filled the air so thick it almost suffocated me. My dress clung perfectly, the lace brushing my skin, as if to remind me that this was real, this was mine. And yet as I took my first step inside, whispers sliced through the music. I turned expecting to see familiar faces, my cousins from Denver, the aunt who promised to fly in from Phoenix. But instead, I froze. The rows reserved for my family were filled with strangers, in threadbare coats, men who smelled of cheap liquor, women clutching plastic bags instead of clutches. Confusion rippled across the room, then laughter sharp and cruel from somewhere behind me. I locked eyes with my mother at the back. She didn't look ashamed. She was smiling. In that instant, humiliation and rage coiled inside me, pressing against my ribs, begging to erupt. I forced myself to breathe, to move, to keep walking toward the altar. But deep down, I knew this was not a mistake. It was a message. And when my father-in-law stood, his voice cutting through the noise, I realized this wedding was never about vows or flowers. It was about the truth none of them wanted me to see. The chandeliers above the ballroom glittered so brightly that I had to blink when I first stepped in. The string quartet in the corner was already playing a soft Mozart piece, and the scent of fresh roses floated through the air. I smoothed the lace on my gown, feeling the silk brush against my wrist. My hands trembled just enough that I clasped them together. Today was supposed to be perfect. Today was supposed to be the day my family finally looked at me. Not as a burden, not as the girl they had ignored in Denver, but as a woman who had built her own life and deserved to be loved. Michael squeezed my hand as we entered. His voice was low, close to my ear. "You look incredible, Emily." His father, Richard Harper, walked just behind us, tall and steady in his dark suit. Most people in Chicago knew his name, a lawyer who built a reputation on truth and precision. I had always admired the way he could quiet a room without raising his voice. I caught his eye, and for a fleeting second I thought I saw concern there, the kind of look a man gives when he knows something is about to break. I wanted to push that thought away. Tonight was about the vows, the music, the family that had gathered. My parents had promised me they would handle everything on their side. They had laughed when I asked about the guest list. "Trust us, Emily," they had said, "we know who matters." I had wanted to believe them. Maybe I was naive, but a small part of me had clung to the idea that this wedding would be the bridge between us. That for once my mother would smile without a trace of disdain, and my father would call me daughter with pride. The ballroom was decorated with white lilies and golden candelabras. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne. Michael's colleagues from Harper & Cole mingled near the bar, laughing about a case they had just won. I overheard one of them whisper that the firm's future looked secure with Michael as vice president. Pride swelled in me. I remembered the first time I met him when I was managing a tech startup's PR campaign. He had walked into the conference room in Chicago with his sleeves rolled up, a folder of legal briefs in hand, and asked if I had the courage to turn a scandal into a story of resilience. We had argued for hours, but by the end of that campaign, he had looked at me with a respect no one in my family ever had. A violin note lingered in the air, high and trembling. My heart beat in rhythm with it. My dress, simple but elegant, trailed softly on the polished marble floor. Guests turned to watch as we passed, their eyes warm, their smiles genuine. For a moment it almost felt like the world was exactly as it should be. I told myself to hold on to that. I spotted my parents at the far end of the room. My mother in a dark satin dress, her pearls catching the light, and my father in a stiff tuxedo. They sat with their heads close together, whispering. When my mother looked up, her eyes met mine. There was no softness in them, only something that made my stomach tighten. I reminded myself to breathe. This was still my day. Maybe I was imagining the coldness. Maybe. Richard placed a hand on Michael's shoulder and murmured something I couldn't hear. Michael nodded slightly. He had been the one who asked his father to look into my family's finances. I knew because I had caught him once late at night on the phone in the kitchen, his voice heavy with worry. He had told me he wanted to make sure nothing from my past could hurt me. I had been torn between gratitude and shame. But tonight I pushed that memory down. Tonight I wanted only to be a bride, not the girl who had grown up in a small Denver house with parents who pretended I was invisible. I walked past the rows of chairs listening to the shuffle of fabric, the coughs, the rustle of programs in people's hands. The minister smiled at me, as if to say, "It is finally here." My throat ached. I wanted to believe that everything, all the years of distance, all the moments of rejection, would end under the golden light of this room. The quartet shifted to a softer melody. Michael leaned close and whispered again, "You're safe with me." His words steadied me more than he knew. I closed my eyes for a second, inhaled the scent of roses, and told myself that this was the beginning I had been waiting for. And yet, as I opened them again, my gaze caught on my parents once more. My mother's lips curved not into a smile, but into something sharper. My father's hands tapped against the table in a rhythm that felt too controlled, too deliberate. A chill crept up my spine so subtle, I almost ignored it. I forced another smile for the guests watching. The music carried on, and I walked forward, every step echoing with the fragile hope that nothing would shatter this illusion before I reached the altar. The first thing that struck me was the silence, the strange lull that settled when I turned my head toward the rows of chairs reserved for my side of the family. Instead of familiar faces, instead of aunts or cousins who should have flown in from Denver or Phoenix, I saw people I had never laid eyes on. Men with worn jackets and boots scuffed to the sole, women clutching old handbags as if they were shields. The satin ribbons tied to the chairs only made their clothes look more threadbare. My breath caught. My steps faltered for a beat before I forced myself forward. A murmur spread like a ripple through the guests from Michael's side. I heard someone whisper, "Who are they?" "Emily's relatives." Another voice, low and uneasy, followed with a clipped laugh. I swallowed hard and tried to smile, but the corners of my mouth refused to rise. These were not my relatives. These were strangers, and the knowledge pressed on my chest like a weight I could not lift. I searched for my parents. My eyes found them near the back, not hiding, not ashamed. My mother sat poised, her chin slightly lifted, pearls glinting under the lights. My father leaned back, arms crossed, a smug curve at his lips. When my mother caught my gaze, she leaned to the side as if sharing a private joke with him, then let her eyes linger on me. Her lips moved just enough for me to read them. "This is who you belong with." A bitter taste filled my mouth. I wanted to look away to focus on Michael, who was waiting at the altar with his steady presence, but I could not. My mother's eyes held me in place, like a pin through glass. She gave a faint smile, the kind she used when she wanted to make sure I understood she had won. My pulse hammered. The quartet kept playing sweet and oblivious, but the music now sounded shrill in my ears. I reached the front row and paused, trying to breathe through the sudden wave of heat that rushed to my face. I could feel people staring, not with admiration, but with confusion, even suspicion. I prayed silently for anyone from my true family to appear, but the seats remained filled only with these strangers. Michael leaned closer as I joined him at the altar. His hand brushed mine discreetly. He whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded quickly, though my throat had closed tight. He glanced toward my parents, his jaw hardening. Richard, standing not far behind, had noticed too. His eyes scanned the unfamiliar faces with the calm assessment of a man gathering evidence. The quiet tension in his stance told me he had expected something, though perhaps not this. The officiant cleared his throat, and the ceremony began. My dress rustled softly as I shifted, trying to steady myself. Each vow spoken by the minister seemed to echo too loudly, bouncing against the marble walls, fighting with the whispers that grew behind me. A woman coughed rough and rattling, and a man shifted in his seat so abruptly the chair legs scraped against the floor. Heads turned. My chest tightened. These were not the sounds of a family wedding. They were the sounds of disruption planted deliberately. I thought of my childhood in Denver, sitting alone on birthdays when my parents forgot to invite friends or pretended to. I remembered the way my mother used to look at me when she thought I was not paying attention, as if I were a mistake she regretted. That same look was on her face now, though sharper, crueler. She wanted me to crumble in front of everyone. She wanted me to feel small again. Michael's grip on my hand grew firmer. He whispered again, "Stay with me." His voice grounded me for a moment, but then I caught a low laugh from my father. It carried further than he intended. A few guests turned. I felt my cheeks burn. My stomach churned with shame, but beneath it, a spark of anger began to rise. The officiant asked us to bow our heads for a short blessing. I closed my eyes, but all I saw was the smirk on my father's face, the mocking curl of my mother's lips. My heart pounded against my ribs. I could feel the walls pressing in the weight of every glance in the room, pinning me down. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Richard. He was watching my parents now not with surprise, but with the keen gaze of a man who had found confirmation of what he already suspected. His shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. I realized he was waiting not for the vows, but for the moment they would make their mistake. The prayer ended, and we lifted our heads. My vision blurred for a second, but I steadied myself. I would not give my parents the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Still, my hands trembled. Michael gave them a gentle squeeze, and I knew he had noticed. His eyes promised me he would not let this pass. I forced another shallow breath, the scent of roses now cloying in my nose. Around me whispers buzzed, confusion mounting. The officiant smiled, trying to smooth over the tension, but the air in the ballroom had changed. I knew this was only the beginning of whatever my parents had planned, and I could feel the ground shifting under me, fragile as glass, ready to crack. The officiant lifted his hands and welcomed the guests with a practiced smile, his voice ringing across the ballroom. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to settle like dust, trying to find a place to land. Then it began. A cough from one of the strangers seated near the front row grew into a fit, his head lolling forward as if he could no longer hold himself upright. Another man, his shirt collar stained and loose, stumbled to the side and knocked over a chair. The screech of wood against marble echoed through the hall. Guests gasped, and a ripple of discomfort swept through the rows. The quartet faltered, but continued playing, the notes suddenly brittle. A woman in the second row giggled nervously, her laugh breaking into an awkward silence. I felt my chest tighten. My cheeks flamed as if every spotlight had turned on me alone. I gripped the hem of my gown, willing it not to shake. Michael leaned toward me, his jaw tense, whispering for only me to hear. "Keep breathing, Emily." I tried, but the stench of cheap alcohol wafted from the rows behind me. My stomach churned. I heard the unmistakable sound of a bottle clinking as it rolled under a chair, followed by a muffled curse. A wave of whispers spread. Who invited them? Are these really her relatives? Two men from Michael's side of the family exchanged a look and rose quietly, their wives following. They slipped out through the side aisle, heads down, but not before casting me a glance filled with pity. I wanted to vanish, to sink into the marble floor. Then I heard it. My father's voice, low but close enough to the microphone near their row that it carried. "She only deserves this." The words sliced through the hall, amplified just enough that the silence afterward made them louder. My knees almost buckled. My mother tilted her head toward him, smiling, as though she approved. Heat pricked the back of my eyes. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. "Do not cry," I told myself. "Not here. Not in front of them." Michael's hand slid into mine, steady and firm. His thumb traced a circle against my skin. His voice was a murmur. "My father will handle this. Trust me." I nodded, though my body trembled. My vision blurred for a second, then cleared. I forced my eyes to the altar, to the minister, who looked bewildered, his eyes darting between me and the restless crowd. The ceremony pressed on his voice, carrying words of union and love that felt foreign against the chaos unfolding. A man in the back shouted something incoherent, his words slurred. Laughter erupted sharp and cutting before dying quickly under the weight of shocked silence. The smell of whiskey grew stronger. My stomach clenched. I could hear the shifting of designer dresses and polished shoes on Michael's side as his relatives whispered, their faces turning stiff and pale with embarrassment. Inside, I felt 12 years old again, standing alone at a middle school recital, while my parents left early, claiming they had somewhere better to be. That same sting of humiliation returned raw and unforgiving. I blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall. Michael squeezed my hand tighter, his grip a lifeline. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw locked. His father, standing at the edge, had moved a step closer. I saw the flicker of steel in Richard's eyes, the calm fury of a man measuring the exact moment to intervene. The officiant's voice wavered as he spoke the next line, trying to regain control, but the atmosphere was fractured. The guests shifted in their seats, whispers swelling again. The opulence of the ballroom, the chandeliers, the roses, all of it seemed to dim beneath the stench of alcohol and the echo of my father's cruelty. My hands trembled, but I kept them clasped in front of me, hiding the quiver in the folds of my gown. My breath was shallow. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, savoring every flinch. She leaned toward my father and whispered something I could not hear, but her smirk was loud enough. The officiant cleared his throat again, attempting to move forward. Michael bent slightly toward me. His words meant only for me. "Hold on, Emily. Just a little longer." His certainty was unshakable, even as chaos spread like cracks in glass. I forced myself to nod, to stay upright, to breathe. But inside, a storm raged. I could no longer tell if the trembling in my chest was shame rage or fear. Perhaps it was all three. The music faltered once more, then stopped entirely. The quartet looked to one another, unsure whether to continue. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. My father's voice lingered in my ears, poisonous and inescapable. Somewhere beyond the haze of shame and noise, I caught Richard's gaze. He was still, but I saw it in the set of his shoulders, in the faint tilt of his head. He had made his decision. And as I stood there, hands cold in Michael's steady grip, I knew something was about to break open, something far larger than the humiliation I was drowning in. Richard Harper stepped forward from his place at the edge of the aisle, his polished shoes clicking once against the marble before the entire hall fell still. He lifted a hand firm and unshaking, and the officiant froze mid-sentence. The quartet, already unsure, let their bows drop against the strings. The silence pressed against my ears, thicker than the whispers that had filled it moments before. "Enough," Richard said, his voice carrying through the ballroom without the need of a microphone. His tone was not raised, but it cut sharper than any shout. The officiant stepped back, unsure whether to continue. Every head turned toward him, the man whose reputation in Chicago courtrooms was almost myth. He looked directly past me, past Michael, and locked eyes with my parents. His gaze did not waver. I saw my mother shift slightly in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, as though she were watching a play, not standing accused in front of 200 guests. My father kept his arms folded, but his smirk faltered. Richard's words rang again. "Someone should explain why the bride's family section is filled with strangers from shelters across Denver." He let the sentence hang, then took a slow step closer. "Is this your way of honoring your daughter? Or is it your way of humiliating her?" The room was stone quiet. Even the men who had been laughing minutes earlier kept their heads down. I felt my throat close, my fingers tightening against Michael's hand. My parents said nothing. My mother's lips pressed together, and my father glanced briefly toward the rows of strangers, as if they had suddenly betrayed him. Richard did not wait. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a leather folder. I knew the weight of it. I had seen the same kind of folder in news clips of courtroom trials. He opened it carefully, as if time itself belonged to him. He looked once more at my parents, then said, "I warned you." My heart skipped. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady. "I have here verified records from the Denver County Clerk's office, evidence of fraudulent charities run under the names of Mr. and Mrs. Miller. These so-called guests were promised food and money to sit here today. Not family, not friends. Victims. A collective murmur swept the room, sharp intakes of breath, gasps that cracked the silence like glass breaking. I felt my knees weaken. It was one thing to suspect another to hear it named aloud in front of everyone. My father lurched halfway to his feet. "That's a lie," he barked, his voice rising too loud too quick. Richard didn't flinch. "Sit down," he said evenly, his words heavier than a gavel. My mother finally spoke, her voice sugar-coated and tight. "This is not the place for your accusations, Richard. We are here to celebrate a marriage." She smiled thinly at the guests, as if she could will them back into her control. But no one smiled back. Richard closed the folder, holding it in one hand, like proof enough. "Then explain," he said, motioning to the rows of ragged coats and hollow eyes. "If this is your idea of family, then let everyone here see it clearly." The strangers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable under the sudden attention. One of them muttered that they had been promised a free meal. The words carried just enough to confirm everything. My mother's face paled beneath the makeup. I wanted to speak, to shout, but my throat was locked. Michael's arm slid behind my back, steadying me. He whispered low, "He's not finished." Richard let the silence do its work. Then he placed the folder on the edge of the officiant's podium. The minister looked at it, his mouth half open as though he, too, was caught in a trial instead of a wedding. My father leaned toward my mother, his whisper too harsh, too frantic, caught by the microphone again. "You promised me this wouldn't come out." The words echoed across the speakers, unintentional and damning. Gasps erupted from the guests. Richard's eyes sharpened, but he did not move closer. He only said, "Everyone in this room deserves the truth, especially your daughter." I could barely breathe. The humiliation was still thick on my skin, but beneath it something else flickered. A fragile thread of relief, as if at last someone had pulled the curtain back. Michael tightened his hold on me, his jaw set. My mother's hands gripped her clutch until her knuckles whitened. My father stared at the folder as though it might burn him if he touched it. And in that charged silence, as chandeliers glittered above us and 200 guests held their breath, I knew this confrontation had only begun. Richard opened the folder with a slow, deliberate motion, and the faint crackle of paper carried louder than it should have in that hushed ballroom. My heart hammered as he drew out several documents stamped with the seal of Denver County. He held one page high enough for the front rows to see, then laid it flat on the podium. His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but every syllable struck like a blow. According to these records, Mr. and Mrs. Miller operated under the name of the Hopeful Hands Foundation, claiming to be a nonprofit for struggling families. Donations were taken thousands of dollars, but the filings never reached the state. The money vanished. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone in the back muttered, "I've heard of that case." Another voice said, "They shut that down 2 years ago." My skin prickled as the weight of shame and vindication tangled inside me. I wanted to collapse and yet stand taller all at once. My father shifted in his seat. His face flushed crimson. He slammed a palm against his thigh. "That's not true," he snapped, his voice cracking. Richard didn't blink. The state of Colorado issued a warning. He continued, sliding another document into view. "And the victims sitting in these chairs are proof enough." One of the ragged guests, a woman clutching a frayed handbag, nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "They promised us help," she whispered, "and instead we got nothing." The whisper carried in the silence, slicing through the grandeur of the ballroom like a knife. My mother leaned forward, her voice sharp. "This is character assassination," she said, trying to summon authority. She raised her chin at the guests. "We are here for a wedding, not a courtroom." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you bring a courtroom here yourself?" He flipped to another page, tapping it with his finger. "This," he said, "is a credit application signed in your daughter's name. Except it is not her handwriting. It is yours." A chill ran through me. My knees buckled slightly and Michael's grip tightened on my hand. I looked at the paper, at the bold loops of a signature I knew too well. My mother's script. For years I had watched her write checks with that same curve in the M. Murmurs erupted again. Fraud, identity theft, prison. The words floated from lips around the room, harsh and unforgiving. My mother's voice wavered, though she tried to sound firm. She gave us permission. That was her choice. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp as glass. Isn't that right, Emily? My throat closed. The room blurred, but I shook my head slowly. No. I never signed anything. My voice cracked raw and small, but loud enough for the officiant to hear, for the guest to catch the truth. My mother's lips parted, but no words came. My father slammed his chair back, the legs screeching against the marble. This is nonsense. We won't stand for this humiliation. He tried to rise, but Richard's stare froze him in place. Sit down, Richard said again, and this time my father obeyed. Phones were lifted now. Guests recorded the scene, the scandal unfolding in real time. I caught sight of the quartet lowering their instruments wide-eyed, as if even music could not mask the spectacle. My heart pounded so hard it felt as though it might break my ribs. Yet beneath the shame, a strange calm began to stir. At least it was no longer hidden. At least the lies were unraveling in front of witnesses. Richard stacked the papers neatly, his hands steady. This is only a portion of what we found, he said. There is more, far more, but perhaps the Millers would like to explain before I continue. His eyes flicked to my parents like the click of a lock. My mother clasped her clutch with white knuckles, her voice breaking. It was all for you, Emily. We needed to secure the future. You were too young to understand. I stared at her numb, then whispered, You stole from me. From all of them. Her face hardened, the mask snapping back into place. She looked away, refusing to answer. My father leaned close to her, whispering something harsh, but the microphone caught fragments again. Should have burned it. Should have buried it. Gasps spread once more. I could not stop trembling. Michael drew me closer, shielding me from the sea of eyes. I felt small, but no longer alone. Richard's presence filled the space like a shield. The chandelier lights gleamed off the folder still open on the podium. Every eye followed Richard's hands as he reached for another document. The air vibrated with anticipation, the certainty that more secrets were waiting to be torn into the light. And in that tense moment, with the ballroom brimming with whispers and the weight of judgment pressing in, I understood that the papers in his hand were not the end. They were only the beginning of a deeper unraveling yet to come. A chair scraped loudly as a man rose from Michael's side of the room. He was tall, in his 50s, with silver hair and a voice that carried even before the microphone caught it. I know her, he said, pointing at me with an open hand, not accusing, but affirming. This young woman led the national media strategy for our firm during the Parker Technologies litigation. Without her, Harper & Cole would never have secured that $20 million victory. The room erupted with gasps. I froze, unable to process his words. My stomach flipped as the truth spilled into the open, not from me, but from someone who had witnessed my work. Faces in the crowd turned, whispers swelled, not of mockery, but of surprise. The name, Parker Technologies, traveled through the rows like a spark catching tinder. Everyone in Chicago remembered that case. Michael's hand pressed mine with fierce pride. His eyes glistened. You don't have to prove anything anymore, Emily. You already did. My throat constricted. For so long, I had hidden my successes, burying them beneath the weight of my parents' scorn. To hear someone else, someone respected, say it aloud in front of my family shattered the chains I had carried since childhood. My back straightened, my shoulders lifted. I stood taller, refusing to cower under my mother's gaze. Guests leaned toward each other, murmuring words I never thought I would hear in connection with my name. Impressive. Accomplished. Resilient. Each murmur felt like balm poured over old wounds. I lifted my chin, letting the light of the chandeliers touch me fully. My mother's face hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line. She gripped her clutch tighter, her knuckles white. My father shifted, restless, his smirk gone. They were losing control of the narrative they had written for me all my life. Richard watched silently, his eyes moving between me and my parents. He seemed almost satisfied, as though this revelation had been part of his calculation all along. The man who had spoken nodded firmly, then sat down again, but his words remained suspended in the air like a verdict no one could overturn. A surge of heat spread through me, not of shame, but of vindication. I turned slightly toward my parents, allowing them to see me not as the girl they had belittled, but as the woman who had built her place in the world without them. My mother's eyes narrowed, sharp with fury. She could not hold her silence. She sprang to her feet, the pearls at her throat trembling against her skin. Her voice cut across the room, shrill and unsteady. "Enough of this charade. You want the truth? Then let them see the truth about her birth certificate." The words struck the room like a lightning bolt. Conversations halted, and every eye swiveled back to me. My chest seized. I felt Michael's grip tense around my hand, his thumb pressing into my palm, steadying me. "What birth certificate?" someone whispered from the back. My mother's voice quavered now, her rage too raw to conceal. She pointed at Richard's folder. "Ask him. He knows." He dug it up. "That girl isn't who she thinks she is." Richard raised his chin, unmoved by her outburst. He did not respond immediately, letting the silence amplify her desperation. The guests watched her, their sympathy evaporating into suspicion. I felt dizzy, caught between humiliation and terror. A secret I never knew hovered above me, heavy and suffocating. My mother's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her composure shattered. My father tugged her sleeve, muttering for her to sit, but she shook him off violently. Michael whispered into my ear, low and certain. "Don't move. Let my father handle this." I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt too small. Around me, the ballroom had become an arena, every guest a witness to my unraveling and rebirth. The chandeliers glared down like spotlights on a stage I had never asked to stand upon. Richard finally picked up the folder again, his face unreadable. He looked at me once, his eyes steady, then turned back to my parents. The next words he spoke would determine everything, but even before he said them, I knew there was no turning back. The truth my mother had tried to bury was clawing its way to the surface, and soon everyone in that glittering hall would see it. Richard lifted another set of papers from the folder, his expression calm but unyielding. He spread them across the podium so that the embossed seal caught the light. My chest constricted as he spoke each word, steady, measured, impossible to ignore. "This is the original trust agreement created by David Miller before his death. It names his daughter, Emily Miller, as the sole beneficiary of assets totaling over $3 million held in an irrevocable trust." The air in the room thickened. My knees wobbled, and I had to grip Michael's arm to keep from collapsing. I had not heard my father's name spoken aloud in years. Hearing it now tied to something so monumental made my throat ache. Richard turned the page and revealed another. Along with it, the birth certificate filed in Denver County, proving that Emily is his only child and rightful heir. His voice did not rise, but the finality of it filled every corner of the ballroom. Murmurs rose from the rows of guests. People craned their necks to see the documents, some pulling out phones to capture the moment. My mother's hand shot out to grab my father's wrist, her nails digging in, but his face had gone ashen. Richard paused, then pressed a button on a small recorder he placed on the podium. A grainy but clear voice filled the speakers. My mother's voice. "We can't let her see the papers. If she knows about the trust, we lose everything. You sign where I tell you, and no one will ever question it." The recording crackled. Then another voice, unfamiliar but male, answered. "What if Harper finds out? He has connections." My mother's voice again, harsh and certain. "Then we make sure Emily never looks beyond what we hand her." A wave of gasps surged through the crowd. Chairs shifted, whispers erupted into a storm. Phones were raised higher, recording every word that condemned her. My heart pounded so hard it blurred my vision. I covered my mouth with my hands. The tears came before I could stop them, hot, unrelenting years of silence breaking open all at once. I had thought I was fighting humiliation tonight, but this was different. This was justice, loud and undeniable. Michael's arm wrapped around me, pulling me close as my body shook. His whisper was fierce. "It's over, Emily. They can't hurt you anymore." The guests erupted into applause, not polite, but raw cathartic, rising in waves that drowned out the last echo of the recording. People stood clapping, some shouting words of support. My vision blurred through the tears, but I saw at hundreds of faces no longer filled with pity, but with solidarity. My father slumped in his chair, his hand covering his face. My mother stood rigid, her lips moving soundlessly, her mask cracked beyond repair. The pearls at her neck trembled with each shallow breath. Richard closed the folder and let the silence after the applause sink deep. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. I sobbed openly now, my chest heaving, but the tears were not of shame. They were of release of years of doubt and longing finally given an answer. I had always wondered if my father had loved me, if he had seen me at all before he was gone. Now I knew. He had left a legacy, not to them, but to me. He had believed in me enough to protect me, even from beyond the grave. I whispered into Michael's shoulder, my voice breaking. He didn't forget me. Michael kissed the top of my head, his voice steady against my storm. He never did. The applause quieted slowly, replaced by murmurs of what would happen next. The officiant stood frozen, his notes trembling in his hand. The quartet remained silent, their instruments lowered. The entire wedding had transformed into a reckoning. I wiped my face, straightened my back, and looked toward my parents. They stared at the marble floor, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time, they were the ones shrinking under the weight of judgment. The chandelier light shimmered above, casting brilliance on the papers still lying on the podium. Every secret, every lie, every theft was now bare for all to see. And though the applause had ended, the electricity in the air told me this was not the conclusion. It was the turning point, the moment before the final collapse. The minister cleared his throat, but did not try to speak. The ballroom was too charged, too raw. My heart still pounded from the revelation, but when I looked up at Michael, his eyes were steady on mine. He lifted both of my hands, his voice low but firm enough for the first rows to hear. "Let's finish what we came here for." I nodded, tears still clinging to my lashes. The officiant stepped forward again, though his words trembled at first, then gained strength as the room hushed. He asked for the rings. Michael reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate, and slipped the band onto my finger. I slid his ring into place, my hand no longer shaking. For a moment, the chaos faded. All I could see was him, his smile faint but resolute, the vow between us untouched by everything swirling around us. The guests began to clap softly, then louder, not out of politeness but in solidarity. The sound swelled until it filled the room. Some people stood, others wiped their eyes. I pressed my forehead against Michael's shoulder, inhaling the clean scent of him, and knew that even if the wedding had broken apart, the marriage was intact. Richard stood nearby, watching. His expression softened. For the first time that day, I saw not the famed attorney, but a father offering me quiet approval. I mouthed a thank you to him, and his nod was enough. The ceremony never truly resumed, yet the vows had been spoken in the only way that mattered. When we walked back down the aisle hand in hand, the applause followed us out of the ballroom. I did not glance back at my parents. I did not need to. Months passed. The investigation that began in that room grew into a federal case. My parents were indicted for charity fraud and identity theft. I read the news in disbelief the first morning it broke. Their faces stared back from a Denver paper, stern and unrepentant, but the headline left no doubt. Guilty. The trial was swift, the evidence undeniable. 10 years in prison, assets frozen, everything they clung to stripped away. I sat in the back of the courtroom on the day of sentencing, Michael's hand in mine, Richard beside us. My mother did not look at me. My father's eyes flicked once in my direction, but carried nothing but bitterness. When the gavel came down, I felt a piece of my chest unlock. It was not triumph. It was released. Out of that wreckage, something new grew. Michael and I launched the New Light Foundation in Chicago. It started in a borrowed office with just 2 staff members. But within a year, it became a resource for women trapped in cycles of financial abuse, offering legal help and counseling. Every time I walked into that office, I thought of the girl I had been, the one with no voice, no protection. I promised myself no woman would stand alone like that again. At our first fundraiser, I stood before a crowd of supporters. My dress simple, my voice steady as I spoke through the microphone. Family is not always where we are born. Family is where we are protected, where we are loved, where we are believed. I looked at Michael in the front row, at Richard beside him, and felt the words anchor deep. I had lost my parents that night in the ballroom, but I had gained a family more real than blood. The applause that night was different from the applause at my wedding. It was not a shock or scandal. It was hope. I pressed a hand to my chest and closed my eyes briefly, whispering to myself that my father, the one who had left me the trust, had not abandoned me after all. He had ensured I would stand here, strong and unbroken. When the crowd dispersed, Michael wrapped his arms around me, and Richard joined us, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I smiled through the blur of tears. For the first time in my life, I was not standing in someone else's shadow. And now, as I tell you this story, I ask you to share your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? Leave your feelings below, subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine, and join me in keeping these conversations alive. Because in the end, none of us should ever stand alone in the face of betrayal.